The most important apologetic text in all of Scripture is Romans chapter 1. In this chapter, God, through Paul, takes the pressure off of you and me to prove God's existence to other people, and maybe some other things as well. So I want to go through this passage with you. To set up the context, in Romans chapter 3, Paul wants to say that in Romans 3:23, all have sinned. And it's important for Paul to say that all have sinned because in chapter 4 and following, he's going to explain why all need Jesus. So if not everyone has sinned, there might be someone out there who doesn't need Christ. So the first 3 chapters of Romans, Paul is proving, demonstrating why all have sinned. In Romans chapter 1, our text, he explains that all Gentiles, all people who have no access to the law, to God's special revelation, they still have sinned and they're culpable, they're accountable to God. In Romans chapter 2, he'll talk about the Jews. They have the law, but they still have sinned as well. They have the law, but they disobey it, so they're culpable. So Romans chapter 1, all Gentiles. Romans chapter 2, all Jews. Well, that's why in Romans chapter 3, Paul can say, well, that's everyone. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So in our passage, Paul is discussing specifically what people are accountable for to God who have never received his special revelation. For people who've never seen the Bible, in what way, what might they know about God? In what ways are they still culpable? So this passage begins in verse 18, and the topic sentence is, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. Now, just a quick aside, in verse 24 and 26 and 28, Paul explains how God's wrath is being revealed. God gave them over, verse 24, to sinful desires. Verse 26, God gave them over to even more shameful lusts. Verse 28, God gave them over to a depraved mind, and they were filled with all kinds of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. So 3 times we're told that God's wrath is revealed by God giving people over to their sin. So just a quick aside, you know how sometimes when you sin, you do something that you know is wrong, but you wanted to do it anyway, and then you kind of brace yourself for God's judgment to fall, and then you were kind of surprised because nothing bad happened that day. You didn't get fired at work. You didn't spill coffee on your shirt. Your kids were nice to you. And yet, well, what's going on? Why isn't God disciplining me? Well, you didn't get away with one, right? Actually, we should be afraid, Hebrews tells us, if we can go on sinning without God's discipline. Now, I'm not saying that every time we sin, God is going to bring the hammer down. But if we continue in sin without discipline, that's not a good sign. And here Romans is saying that sin is so bad that that sin itself is its own punishment. So God's wrath is revealed by God giving people over to more of their sinful desires. And just note there seems to be a progression here. First, there's the root sin of idolatry, which leads to sexual immorality. And then there's, in verse 26, the next stage is homosexual lust and attraction and acting out on that. And then verse 28, it hits rock bottom with all these sins of the spirit. So wickedness, evil, greed, depravity, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. Paul's just ticking off sins as fast as he can. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. What? Disobeying parents, that's rock bottom, right? That matters. So all to say that homosexual practice, it is part of the list. It's not the only sin. And so we don't want to make too much of it and call it out like it's the number one sin. But it is part of the list. And we also do people no favors if we ignore it and paper it over. In fact, look at verse 32. Paul ends this chapter by saying, although they know God's righteous decree, that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Hear the warning of Romans 1. If we approve of people who do these sins, if we tell them it's not really sin, it's actually a good thing, it's being true to who you are, I think Romans 1 is saying that we are placing ourselves under God's wrath. Because maybe we're not sinning, maybe we're not doing these sins, but we're saying it's okay. And of course, that's also true about sins of gluttony and envy and strife and gossip. So whatever the sin is, we don't ever want to be caught approving of it. And as you know, and today, there is a certain amount of cultural pressure to approve of what God calls sin. And of course, if God calls something sin, it's because it's rebellion against Him, it's ingratitude for who He made us to be, and it's also destructive to ourselves. So that's just a quick aside, just to note that in this Romans 1:18-32, there's topic sentence, God's wrath is being revealed. How His wrath is revealed is God giving people over to their sin. What we want to focus on, though, is why God's wrath is revealed upon Gentile people. And here we find a couple things. First, verse 19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So Romans 1:19-20, God says very clearly, everyone knows that I exist. Everyone knows my eternal power and divine nature. If they say they do not know, well, there's just no excuse for that. It's inexcusable. There's no excuse that I will accept for people saying they honestly did not know that I existed. So that's the point here, right? Unbelief in God is not entirely honest. It's not entirely rational. God says in His Word, everyone knows something about me. But they suppress it. They push it down. Even the act of suppression indicates you know something, right? You wouldn't suppress if it wasn't something you're trying to push against. So the fact that they're suppressing this truth, trying to push it down, shows deep down they do know. But they are suppressing, so in one sense you can say they don't know because they're blinding themselves. So see, someone who does not believe in God, who says they don't believe in God, they're in a very unstable epistemological situation. Because deep down they know, and yet they're suppressing it, and so consciously in the front of their mind they don't know. So they're ignorant, but as Calvin says, it's a culpable ignorance. They don't know, but it's their own fault. If you are ignorant of something, if you don't know something, but you should know it, and it's your own fault that you don't know it, well, that's culpable, and God will hold you accountable. So here's what I like about this text. It takes the pressure off of me. Whenever I speak to someone who is not yet a Christian, I know for sure that I do not have the burden of proof, right? That's a big discussion question in apologetics. Who has the burden of proof? Is it my job? Do I have to prove to someone that God exists? How can I do that? You can't prove God from below. But what if Romans 1 is true? And everyone I talk with already knows that God exists. In fact, they can't not know it. And they have to actively push it down and suppress it to try to convince themselves they really don't know it. If that's the case, I don't have to argue with people. I don't have to try to debate them. I can just buy coffee and let's have a conversation. And I can ask questions trying to prompt them to bring out what they already know. So it's just so freeing. I call this, it's like a scouting report on unbelievers. It's inside information. I know something about them that maybe they're not willing to admit themselves. One example of this in my own experience, and again, it's anecdotal, and anecdotes don't prove anything, but just to tell you that this does work. I was spent a couple years in Beijing way back in 1990, 92, and I was teaching English there and trying to evangelize my my students. And there was one student who we spent a lot of time together playing badminton and just having a relationship. And for my first year there, we would often talk about God and how we know that He exists. And I could never convince her. No matter what argument I produced, she would say, "Yeah, but what about this? What about that?" And it was frustrating because I really cared about this student and I wanted her to believe, and I couldn't prove it. And then there's this international church in Beijing, and I was scheduled to preach, and I forget why, but I picked Romans 1 as my text. And as I was studying this text, I said, that's interesting. Everyone knows, even my friend, she knows that God exists. And so the next time she brought up, here's how it would typically start. Professor Whitmer, tell me why you believe in God. And this time I was ready for her. I said, Xu-Wei, why do you? And I'll never forget, she said, oh. And that was it. Romans 1 had called her bluff. And then I thought, yeah, of course. Here's a young woman who has grown up in an atheistic country where she's taught from kindergarten on that there is no God. And we're more advanced. We know better than that. And that's been drilled into her. She's been indoctrinated into not believing in God. And yet why for a whole year was she trying to have these conversations? Because deep down she knew. And instead of trying to prove it to her, I just had to kind of turn and say, well, tell me why you believe in God. So it's just, now, I'm not saying this will work all the time because Romans 1 says people are suppressing. And so there's a fairly good chance that, depending on the person, they might get angry with you and say, how dare you? Of course. But again, that's what, if they're suppressing like God says they are, that's what we might expect as well. So it takes the work of the Holy Spirit, right? Only the Holy Spirit can change people's hearts and open their eyes so they see the truth of God clearly. But they know. So again, it depends on the relationship, and it's very pastoral how you talk with people. But if you're good friends with someone and you have that relationship, I would tell them, what's the most compelling reason for convincing you that you believe in God? I think it's just deep down, you do. You do believe in God. Well, why is that persuasive? Because you know that you do. A belief in God is not something you're able to give up. You might have doubts, but in fact, just try this thought experiment for yourself. Don't do it while you're driving, but when you're sitting somewhere comfortably, try to make yourself stop believing in God. I bet you can't do it. A wave of nausea will roll over you. And if you think you can convince yourself that there is no, convince yourself at least temporarily to not believe in God, well, at least maybe you could try to think you've done that, but I know you can't live as if there's a God. Because every time you make a moral claim and say this is right or this is evil, you're assuming God's existence. Every time you trust your rationality and that your eyes and ears and your senses are working properly, what are you assuming? Well, as Plantinga says, there's a God who made you and made your mental equipment and put you in this world and that's fit for you to detect what's actually there. Why do you not run into walls? Because deep down, you believe there's a God who made you the knowing subject and made this world the object of your knowledge, the environment that's right for you, and put you together. So even if someone says, I think I honestly don't believe there's a God, I know they can't live as if that's the case. So verses 19 through 20 say, everyone knows God's eternal power and divine nature. And then, notice in verse 32, they also know God's righteous decree, that those who do these sins deserve death. Two things God says everyone knows about him. Romans 1, 19 and 20, they know that he's almighty, his eternal power and divine nature. Verse 32, they also know that he's righteous, or I guess alrighty. They know his righteous decree. Now, everyone knows that, or should know that, if they just stop to think about it. Well, if that's the case, what else might they conclude? Everyone knows there is a God, he's all-powerful and righteous. What should they think about themselves? I'm not. Oh no. There's a God who's righteous and I'm not. What should they logically think then they need? Help. How much help? All of it. I need God to do all of it. I can't lift even a little pinky finger to save myself if there's this God who's all powerful and all righteous. Okay, how many candidates are there for that job? I think just one. Jesus is the only claimant to be God who says salvation is grace. It's pure gift. It's 100% hand out. Isn't that interesting? If I was Satan, and I'm not, but if I was Satan, I think I would make a counterfeit religion and just change the names. Instead of Jesus, it's a British guy named Charles. Instead of the cross, it's a guillotine. And Charles sacrificed his life so we could be saved by grace, and just confuse people with changing up the story. But it's the same basic plot. Kind of like Harry Potter kind of ripped off the Bible. It changed Jesus to Harry, but it's the same story basically. Why didn't Satan do that? Well, I think Satan has never received grace. Right? When Lucifer sinned, he was cast out of heaven. And it probably infuriates him that God made these other creatures that were less than him, Adam and Eve, and they did the very same thing that he did. And then what? God sacrificed himself to win them back? Probably nothing infuriates, incenses Lucifer more than grace. He must hate it so much he can't even fake it. So Romans 1, it's pure gold, right? It's just so, it doesn't prove that Jesus is a son of God, but I think it does demonstrate that if everyone just put their phones down and turned off YouTube and just thought for a while about what do they know about God from the world and from themselves, they should logically conclude there is a God, I'm not him, I'm in trouble, I need grace, only one person offers that. I'm not sure if Jesus is God, but man, he's the only one who even offers the very thing that I need. So I think that can go a long way in having fruitful gospel conversations that might lead people to Jesus. Like, again, we can't prove God, we can't prove Jesus from below, but we know some things about what they know. And I think it can be quite helpful and hopefully leading many people to Jesus.